Good evening. I'm Scott Litke, Executive Director of the Institute for Holocaust Education. Tonight, we come together as a community to virtually commemorate Yom HaShoah, the day chosen by the country of Israel in the early 50s to remember the events of the Shoah. Participating in tonight's commemoration, along with myself, are IHE's Education Coordinator, Ms. Kale Sagir, second generation survivors, Chazan Michael Krausman, and Dr. Stephen Weiss, along with third generation survivor, Ms. Sarah Kutler. We could begin the commemoration with a reading of the poem, A Small Station of Treblinka. Dr. Weiss, please go ahead.
Here is the small station of Treblinka. Here is the small station of Treblinka. On the line between Toulouse and Warsaw, from the railway station, Warsaw East. You get out of the station and travel straight. The journey lasts 5 hours and 45 minutes more. And sometimes the same journey lasts a whole life until you're deaf, and the station is very small. 3 fir trees grow there, and a regular signboard saying, "Here is the small station of Treblinka. Here is the small station of Treblinka." And no cashier even. Gone is the cargo man, and for a million zloty, you will not get a return ticket. And nobody waits for you in the station, and nobody waves a handkerchief towards you. Only silence hung there in the air to welcome you in the blind wilderness. And silent is the pillar of the station, and silent are the 3 fir trees, and silent is the blackboard, because here is the small station of Treblinka. Here is the small station of Treblinka. And only a commercial board stands still, quote, cooked only by gas, end quote. Here is the small station of Treblinka. Here is the small station of Treblinka.
El Molerachamim Shochein Bameromim Hametzeh Menuchanechona Tachat Kanefei Ashechina Bemalot Kedoshim Kedoshim Udiyarim Kizawar Haraki L'nishemot kol acheinu b'nei Yisroel shenidbechu b'shoah anashim, nashim v'tav שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו שמסרו את נפשם על קידוש השם. הרחמים, אז תראה אם אשאת כנפיך מעולמים. וצרור מצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו שלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר Amen.
A memorial prayer. O God of Israel, we remember the countless numbers of people who have suffered unspeakable agonies and death. Some were silent sufferers, some rebelled, all were murdered. Some are still remembered by friends and loved ones, others have vanished with no earthly remembrance. We plead that you will remember them all, that you will hold them in your heart, and that you will find their peace, and they will find their peace with you. God of our fathers and mothers, our eyes are now witnesses for the suffering of Israel. Our hearts have been torn as we mourn for our people. We will not forget one single thing, not forget to the last generation, lest we ignore threats to our people and all human degradation, or we've learned nothing. We've learned nothing at all.
We remember them. In the rising of the sun and in its going down, we remember them. In the blowing of the wind and the chill of winter, we remember them. In the opening buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember them. In the blueness of the sky and in the warmth of summer, we remember them. In the rustling of leaves and in the beauty of autumn, we remember them. In the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember them. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them. When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember them. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember them. So long as we live, they too shall live, for now they are a part of us as we remember them. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, our third generation survivor, Sarah Kutler, who is the granddaughter of Bea Karp. Bea was a pioneer in survivor testimony, telling her story for over 50 years. And while we are devastated that we lost her, we are thrilled that Sarah has decided to pick up her mantle and be part of our Speakers Bureau. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Kale, for that very lovely introduction. Thank you to everybody else as well. So good evening, everyone who is watching. I'm honored to have this privilege of speaking in front of you tonight, unfortunately online and not in person. But before I start, I just wanted to piggyback off of Kale and say that I am carrying on my grandma's legacy by giving this speech. And tonight I am able to remember her and all of her greatness. And then tonight I'm also remembering, if any of you know my Aunt Jeannie Soshnick, also formerly known as Jeannie Pappenheimer, She died Monday morning, and so everybody's upstairs doing Shiva right now, and I feel so privileged that I get to be here speaking to you guys. So this is for both my grandma, for all the lives lost during the Holocaust, and also for my aunt. So yes, Kale said, my name is Sarah Kutler. I was born and raised in the good old Omaha, Nebraska, and I am currently working to receive a graduate degree in social work at the Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. And my grandma was Bea Karp. My grandma went to services every Saturday morning, often taking me with her. And her favorite part about being at services, besides the lunch and kugel, of course, was hearing the rabbi give the Devorah Torah. And I could tell as I watched her listen to the rabbi that she found something meaningful in every Devorah Torah, ultimately changing how she viewed different aspects of the world or everyday life. And I can only hope as you listen to me tonight that I can provide a similar meaningful narrative to you. We all know about the horrific events that took place during the war and the unimaginable actions that mass amounts of humans declared on groups of people considered as others. And as a strong Jewish community, it is our responsibility to be educated on this topic. Although I think it critical that you are all aware of the brutality my grandma faced during the Holocaust, I'm not going to recite her whole story before you tonight. However, I'd rather take the time to tell you of the resiliency my grandma displayed during World War II and how she persisted as a young girl into adulthood to make her life meaningful by educating others. You hear as third generation that it is up to the descendants to keep our ancestors' stories alive, to teach others of the importance of remembering the Holocaust so it never happens again. But as I bring a social justice perspective to this speech, you will know by the end that this surely isn't so. And as I sit here telling you my grandma's story, I want you all to think about your grandmas during this time, because we've all had them. And most importantly, we all have a story to tell, experiences that are unique from the person next to us. And in many respects, a personal narrative is an authentic political form of self-representation that holds the power to promote change. And your experiences are where you stand in a space to promote change for the world. Certain changes that can ensure that the Holocaust will never happen again. So my grandma was born Beate Stern in 1932 in Lauterbach, Germany. Her mother's name was Rosa, her father Moritz, and her younger sister is named Susie. She was 7 years old when the Nazis came to power. She was forced out of her home, ripped apart from her family, and like many others had endured some of the most inhumane torture any person could ever experience. Her mother told her that she could not play outside in fear that someone might shoot her. My grandma was bullied harshly by other kids at school who used to be her friends, and they would take her braids and dunk them in the inkwells. And she was pushed down and called a dirty Jew or a Christ killer. And the teachers would call her out in class and have her come up to the front, have her hold her fingers up like so, and smack them with their rulers. And my grandma's life changed forever at 7 years old, but unlike millions of other children, she had forever to look forward to. Although my grandma was faced with some of the worst people known in history, she never went down without a fight. One day, as my grandma took a risk to play outside her home, she saw 2 Nazi soldiers standing a few yards away. Infuriated about what they were doing to her beautiful country, she picked up a handful of stones and threw them at the soldiers' backs. My grandma was lucky that she knew the streets of her hometown better than they did, because imagine being chased by 2 armed men who were killing off your people one by one just because. A few weeks went by when a group of Nazis came to her neighborhood to round up the Jews. My grandma watched as soldiers barged in her home and destroyed everything she loved. They told her family to prepare for transportation and pack enough essential items for 2 weeks. So the first thing my grandma gathered was her porcelain doll. This doll was her most prized possession. And a Nazi came up to her and said, "Where you are going, you won't need that doll." My grandma looked at him, looked back at her doll, looked back at him and said, "If I can't have this doll, you can't have her either." And she smashed her doll's face on the floor, and she saw her doll's face shattered into pieces, almost as a resemblance of her childhood being shattered in front of her. My grandma and her family were taken to a railroad station and shoved into cattle train cars with little airflow, small portions of bread for everyone to share, and a bucket in the corner for you to go to the bathroom. My grandma licked the windows to try and get any moisture so she could have some water. And when the train rails came to a screeching halt at Gurs concentration camp, terrified people filed out of these cattle cars to Nazis screaming, "Mach schnell, mach schnell," which means hurry, hurry. Upon arrival, the Nazis searched everyone for money, gold, and anything valuable. And this included jewelry and gold teeth, which were yanked from their owners' mouths without warning. And my great-grandmother did not even have the chance to take her gold hoop earrings out from her earlobes before a Nazi tore them. A typical day at Gurs consisted of being awoken early in the morning, and by 9 a.m., my grandma and the others had to line up for roll call outside, no matter what the weather was like. Then all the children had to walk for such a long time that my grandma would never even ask if she could go to the bathroom. She would just walk. And some days the children were able to clear sticks and stones so another barrack could be built. However, I want you to think about doing these things when you're sick, because you would not want to walk all day or pick up sticks if you had a sore throat. Well, imagine doing this if you had sores all over your body from itching the lice in your hair and on your clothing, or having to stuff your shoes with leaves because all of the miles you walked created holes on the soles of your shoes, or worse. One day, my grandma and her sister Susie decided they wanted to try and see their father on the men's side of camp. They marched up to a soldier and said, "We would like to see our father." And the soldier laughed. Irritated with the man towering over her, my grandma called him a dirty pig, kicked him in his boot, grabbed her sister's hand as they walked towards the men's side of Gurs. And she told Susie, "Whatever you do, don't look back," hoping that they wouldn't be shot in their backs. Remember how I said my grandma didn't go without a fight? Surprisingly, they did make it to the men's entrance on the other side of camp and saw their father. And while trying to catch up during the little time that they had, the Nazis handed out a single egg to each of the male prisoners. My grandma had never seen an egg in the concentration camps before and surely thought that her papa would share. She observed him carefully, cracked the egg, and stirred the white and the yolk together. However, she could see that there was blood in the egg and watched as her father became agitated. My grandma was raised as an Orthodox Jew, which means that they were not allowed to eat the blood-stained egg, as that indicates that life must have begun. But my grandma thought that my great-grandfather would make an exception, considering that they were starving. But suddenly, he threw the egg at the barrack wall. My grandma thought of running to lick the oozing yolk off the wall, but believed that it was not worth her father's anger. My grandma always said that this was a valuable teaching moment during her time in the camps. My great-grandfather's reaction demonstrated that while he had no control over what the Nazis did to him physically, he still had a choice. And that choice of not eating the egg was his way of maintaining his Judaism and his humanity, despite being dehumanized and treated like someone who did not deserve respect. My grandma and her family were held at Camp Gers for some time before being transferred to another camp called Rivsalz. My grandma's sister had become very weak and thin from the disease that she had developed. Their mother, Rosa, had been coordinating with the French OSE, which is a humanitarian organization that rescued children, for a way to get frail Susie out of the camp in order to save her life. One day, before my grandma had time to process, her sister was gone. And without her sister to talk to, my grandma made friends with the rats and the mice in the garbage cans as she shared whatever crumbs of leftovers she could find. Soon after, my grandma also became very sick with cholera. Again, Rosa had to make the difficult decision of not keeping her baby with her in the concentration camp and gave my grandmother to be hidden by the OSE and be cared for by strangers. However, she hoped that Susie and my grandma were better off hiding with strangers than living in the horrid conditions, catching life-threatening diseases, slowly starving, and witnessing terrible atrocities. The first OSE home that my grandma was taken to was a large chateau with 3 to 4 adults per 100 children. And the children had daily chores and learned survival skills in case they needed to hide in the forest due to another Nazi raid or the threat of bombs. To better keep the children hidden, the OSE had all the children change their names to make them less vulnerable of being discovered. So my grandma's original name was Beata in German, and it was then changed to Beatrice, which she kept for the rest of her life. They were also given a street address in Paris to memorize in case anyone asked where they were born or where they lived. Since the children were in hiding from the Nazis, they did not stay in one chateau for too long and were constantly being moved from place to place. My grandma remembered moving 14 times. And one day at the Chateau Chaumont, one of the largest of the OSE homes, a little girl brought my grandma a blanket. And this girl looked familiar, but she could not quite put a finger on it. This girl's head had been shaven, as it was a common way to get rid of head lice. And after a few moments, my grandma realized that it was her little sister, Susie. Months later, while walking down the streets of France, my grandma saw American planes fly overhead. And at that moment, she knew the war was coming to an end. The OSE had put an ad in their German Jewish newspaper that circulated internationally, stating that Beata and Susie Stern were looking for any living relatives. And with the two girls still being very weak and sick, they set out on a journey to London where one of their uncles lived. While living there, my grandma continued to look for information about her parents, still hoping that they were alive, but their names were never found on the list of survivors. A few years passed by when my grandma and her sister set out on a journey to the United States to live with their 2 aunts in New York. And without knowing much English, my grandmother took an exam to attend American high school at the age of 15, and then soon became an honors student. And by the age of 18, she graduated with her high school diploma. In New York, she met her late husband, Robert Pappenheimer. And eventually they moved to O'Neill, Nebraska to work for his brother-in-law, and together they started a family. They had 4 daughters. First, my Aunt Roxy, then my Aunt Jeannie, next my Aunt Debbie, and lastly, my mother Nancy. And between her 4 daughters, my grandmother had 7 grandchildren, including me being the youngest. And my grandma always told me that we were the best revenge she could ever had against Hitler, a man who wanted to wipe all the Jews off the face of the planet. After the Eichmann trial in 1961, people became increasingly curious about what had happened during World War II and the Holocaust. My grandma was asked if she would speak to a group about her experiences and what she suffered. Hesitant about reopening that traumatic chapter of her life, my grandma did eventually accept the invitation, and soon word spread because people were calling from all over to have my grandma speak to different groups, especially school children. And from there on, public speaking had become my grandma's passion and a significant part of her life. Many students would write to her after her talks and tell her what they had learned about prejudice and bullying being terrible things. A quote from my grandma I want to share with you is this: "I feel I am doing something good. I learned from my experiences and I learned to cope with life no matter what happens to you. And you have two choices. One is to give up and say, poor me. The other is to go on with your life and pick up the pieces and do the best that you can. I feel I am more resilient because of the war, and I want others to know of the struggle and the horror so that it never happens again. But I also want them to know of our ability to preserve and that good can come even after what seems like the worst." My grandma died 2 years ago, and it was one of the hardest times of my life. She was a beloved member of the Jewish community. She was my best friend, and she was a hero to many people. She devoted her life to the obligation to present her personal narrative for over 50 years to thousands of students in schools and others because she wanted to make sure something like the Holocaust never happens again. The point of my grandma's message was not to tell people what had happened to her, but to speak for the individuals who had their voices taken from them, the millions of innocent lives that had been murdered for just being who they are. Of those who survived the war, only a handful of individuals went on to speak about their experiences, as going through such a brutal trauma can be very difficult to discuss. And because many could not, my grandma provided an opportunity for individuals to have a face-to-face interaction with the last witnesses who can speak about the atrocities of the Holocaust. And as time goes on, however, we are losing survivors every day and therefore losing those firsthand accounts. And this is why I feel compelled to be here today, to give you my insight on how we can accomplish a goal like making sure something like the Holocaust can never happen again together. So one thing that always struck me is that when we think of the Holocaust, we think of the war against the Jews. And rightfully so, as this was the largest population affected during those torturous times. However, I also want you all to acknowledge the other groups that were impacted. While my grandma lived in England with her relatives, she once asked her aunt, "Is the war against the Jews still going on?" And her aunt responded, "Well, it wasn't just a war against the Jews, it was a world war." You see, there were 17 million lives taken during the Holocaust, and to name a few were the Jews, the Soviets, the Gypsies, disabled people, gays and lesbians, Blacks, Roman Catholics, and so many more. And a question that always puzzled me growing up was, how could someone like Hitler obtain such immense power and get away with genocide? And a host of factors contributed to the environment under which these atrocities were committed, ranging from general racism, anti-Semitism, blind obedience, political opportunism, coercion, and xenophobia. And when the Great Depression hit, Hitler took advantage of people's anger and economic fear by offering them convenient scapegoats and making promises of restoring Germany, which included getting rid of the Jews. But why didn't anyone do anything to stop him? Because he gave them a reason to be silent, and this silence is what creates the bystander. Being a bystander means that you see someone in need of help, but you don't provide it. This inaction is amplified when other people are present. So let's take a car crash, for example. When you are the only witness to an accident, more than likely you will get out of your own car to provide some form of assistance, whether that's calling 911 or seeing if anyone was injured. However, if you witness a crash on a busy street, your first thought more than likely is going to be, well, I got to go to work. and surely someone else is going to stop. We can relate this concept to the Holocaust, where millions of people were being murdered, and it took years for action to take place. Similar to the bystanders during the war, we see and hear about horrible things that happen every single day, and whether that's with our neighbors or strangers on the other side of the world. And all too often, we do nothing just because it's the easy way out. But instead of doing nothing, it's important that when we learn of such misfortunes, to empathize with those who are affected rather than sympathize. Sympathy is feeling sorrow or pity for the hardships that another person encounters. And then empathy, on the other hand, is putting yourself in the shoes of another. I know it might be hard to imagine what it's like when horrible things happen to other people. In fact, we hear so many bad things happening in the news that we sometimes feel numb or desensitized to them, especially when it doesn't affect us directly. Although it's hard to imagine that something like the Holocaust ever occurred, it did, and it can, and sadly, it is again. So let's look at some patterns and connect the dots. My grandma was told by her mother that she could not leave their home to play outside in fear that she might be followed or harassed or captured or even killed. Today, there are Black lives screaming from the rooftops that they are tired of being followed around the department store or risking their lives to go on a run in a neighborhood because they might get shot. And what about Rosa making the difficult decision of separating from her babies to send them out of the concentration camp to live with strangers? Today, our friends south of the border or other immigrants are on treacherous journeys to seek asylum from the dangers of their own neighborhoods, knowing that their babies will be separated from them and put in detention centers. And there are plenty more patterns for me to unveil here. I could go all night. So although Holocaust Remembrance Day is very critical for us to observe, important for us to never forget, the real importance lies in what we have learned from our history and our perseverance. Because minor forms of the Holocaust are happening all around us. And if you say that you would have shown up during the war and not have been a bystander then, tell me, how are you showing up for the people subjected to injustices now? When injustices occur and people are oppressed, most people do not understand the ripple effect or the ramifications of this wrong and how it influences other individuals or groups who are not directly affected. Like the world looks at the Holocaust as the war against the Jews, we tend to focus on how one cohort or group of humans are impacted rather than the larger picture. For example, when a person comes out publicly as gay, their chances of being bullied by other children and adults is 3 times that of their heterosexual peers. And this then affects their families on a meso level, where their family members could be subjected to hate crimes. And then this then affects the LGBTQ+ community on a macro scale, because they internalize to suppress who they truly are when they see bad things happening to members of their group. On a different note, Black mothers are 4 times more likely to give birth to premature babies than white mothers. And the reason being is discrimination, as women of color are given altered care and treated differently during their pregnancies. So the baby is already feeling the repercussions of oppression before it is even brought into this world. Hatred does not just affect a single individual. It may not affect us directly, but it does indirectly by creating this imbalance in our world. It creates war. And although blatant forms of discrimination have been prohibited in our society, we must be mindful of how systemic oppression has been manifested through our unconscious biases or our own ignorance. One of my favorite quotes is by Martin Luther King Jr. "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." So how can we drive out the darkness and hate? To not become a bystander to the oppression of others, and to empower people to not feel alone, and to make sure something like the Holocaust never happens again. First, I want you all to enlighten yourselves. I gave you some statistics about the LGBTQ+ community and pregnant Black women, but there are so many injustices regarding other groups to be educated about. It's important to go into situations with humility and curiosity for groups and cultures that are different from your own. Being cognizant about the multidimensional real-world obstacles that others face can help you be more aware of their struggles. And like I said at the beginning, we all have a story to tell, with unique experiences that are different from the person next to us. And the second thing I want you to do is to check yourselves. Check yourselves of your judgments and challenge your biases. Instead of telling someone that they are wrong or bringing them down for how they live their lives, try to understand their distinct point of view and consider their thoughts as being valid. You don't have to adopt their opinions, but you can agree to disagree and accept different lifestyles. Because if everyone in the world acted the same way and thought the same things, don't you think the world would be so boring? But imagine the world of knowledge you would have if you went beyond your comfort zone to get to know other populations, whether that involves going across the world or talking to someone at work that you have never talked to before. This also involves having the ability to engage in open conversations with individuals who have those dissimilar beliefs. Having open conversations with your children at an early age is equally important. Parents, I know it feels impossible sometimes to put into words the really big issues and the loaded topics. But in the age of cell phones and streaming videos and 24-hour news coverage, when even the little kids are exposed to really serious stories, it's important to face this challenge head on. This not only allows the kids the opportunity to have their questions answered by you and not some other source, but it also helps them to feel safer. And when you show them how to gather and interpret information, ask questions, and cross-check sources, they become critical thinkers. Lastly, I want you to be open to change. This includes opening your mind to others' perceptions, but this also includes allowing different paths to be present and considering the options to go in either direction. As humans, we are deeply rooted in how we think things should be and are always trying to maintain the status quo. For example, we are slowly moving away from societal norms that constrain us to the expectations of going to college, getting a steady job, getting married, then having kids, and then retiring at the age of 65. Social media and other forms of media reinforce the idea that things should be a certain way or another. But most people fear the idea of personal change because we think that to give something up, that means we must sacrifice something else. But humans are so innovative and resourceful, and when we combine those characteristics with love and compassion as our guiding truth, we can develop and implement systems of change that are beneficial to all living beings and our environment. So I want to challenge you to be empathetic, to not take the easy way out, to be educated, to be bold, and to be open. Don't be a bystander when you see something wrong. Speak up. And all of these skills surface with practice because they don't always come naturally. Dr. Maya Angelou said, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. We don't just show up and then magically wait to know better. We show up, and then when we are corrected, we keep working and continue to persevere. If anything, our Judaism and the history of our ancestors has taught us there is so much power in the unity of our community. Our strength allows us to say that we are all survivors because our unique narrative is the story of our ancestors, equally those who survived and those who perished during the Holocaust. My grandma, Bea Karp, instilled in me the importance of knowing where I came from and my strength as a third-generation Holocaust survivor. My power is keeping my grandmother's legacy alive and teaching others how to combat hate so something like the Holocaust never happens again. And as my grandma would always end our conversations, bye-bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was absolutely beautiful. May your grandmother and your aunt's memory be for a blessing. Next,
Thank you.
we have the lighting of the yellow candle. The concept of a special yellow candle, a Yortzeit candle, was originally developed in the 1970s by survivors of the Shoah at gatherings in their local community men's clubs. By 1980, brotherhoods in Canada and Massachusetts had redefined and expanded the program. News quickly spread to the rest of the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs. The yellow candle's purpose was to provide people with a familiar and meaningful ritual that would enable them to remember the victims of the Shoah with the observance of it in their homes. Since then, the Shoah yellow candle has been adapted and expanded to be used in almost every Yom HaShoah service in the world. The yellow candle is modeled after the Jewish Yortzeit candle, which burns for 24 hours during periods of mourning and the anniversary of the death of a family member. The yellow is symbolic of the yellow star worn by Jews during the Holocaust. I would now like to ask Chazan Michael Krausman to light the candle, yellow candle for us, followed by Mourner's Kaddish.
יתקדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ילמד דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בגליו בזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ומעלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל, שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, תמירון בעולמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
Never again. A silent scream lost in time, a shadow play in the dark. So many people lost now. Who can speak up for them? Shall I whisper in your ear? Can I shout in the street, stand up and be counted? Who can speak out for them? Burial pits for broken lives. Never again can this happen. Broken up, no more dreams. I tell you now, never again.
Never Shall I Forget by Elie Wiesel. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in the camp, that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. As we conclude this evening with Hatikva, which means the hope. It is our hope for a better world. It is our hope that together we will be in person for next year's commemoration of Yom HaShoah. I would like to thank our 2G and our 3G participants and my colleague, who I'm extremely grateful to, Kale Sagir, for her participation. I thank you all for being here, and we close with Hatikva.
Kol od balevav penima nefesh Yehudi homiya ulefate mizrach kadima ayin letzion Sophia, Olaveda Tigvatenu, Hatikva bat Shnot Alpayim, Liotam Chofshi Be'artzenu, Eretz Zion, Yerushalayim, Liotam Chofshi Be'artzenu, Eretz Zion, Yerushalayim.
Thank you all for being here. Good night.